Just how tall were the Nephilim giants, warrior kings who walked the earth before and after the flood? There are at least 5 major sources from the BC period, claiming several different heights for the giants. So what are they, and which height is most likely correct? Many are skeptical about the existence of the giants, not just because of their bizarre origin, but because they can't see a way to reconcile the giants with modern science and archaeological discoveries. But did you know some ancient sources suggest a more realistic height for the Nephilim giants? And what the Bible says about Goliath's height might not mean what we think it means. Let's do some detective work. This was a very difficult study. It took me hours and a couple of weeks because I had to read a bunch of manuscripts and a 35-page academic research paper. I read it, so you don't have to, but if you're a glutton for punishment, I'm going to put the link in the description below. Source number 1, 1st Enoch. Arguably the most famous comprehensive writing we have on the Nephilim giants. In Enoch, and arguably the Old Testament, the giants have a supernatural origin. They're the offspring of fallen angels and human women, so you can expect that they might have some unusual features, one being their height. And right off the bat, our investigation gets pretty complicated. As a source, I'll be referencing Michael Heiser's book, A Companion to the Book of Enoch. You can find the link to get a copy in the description of this video. Heiser says we have several different translations of 1st Enoch. In chapter 7, verse 2, the Greek fragments say the giants were 3,000 cubits tall. Many scholars assume Enoch used a standard Hebrew cubit and assume this would equal approximately 18 inches. More on that later, but this would make the giants a whopping 4,500 feet tall. That's more than twice the height of the world's tallest building in Dubai. On the other hand, the Ethiopic version says the Nephilim were great giants whose height was 300 cubits. Well, this would still make the giants about 450 feet tall, but which one of these is correct? Some of our ancient copies of Enoch are really not in very good condition, some of them are damaged, and some places are illegible, making it difficult to read. So one of these numbers is likely a scribal error. We could take a more conservative approach and just assume the 300 cubits is more accurate, but even this presents a difficulty for a lot of people. The tallest recorded dinosaur, the Sauroposeidon, was about 56 feet tall. So, if giants 9 times taller than dinosaurs walked the earth, why haven't we discovered their skeletons? At this point, many would classify the Nephilim as mythology and just ignore them, and maybe take part of the Bible with it too. However, 2 possible explanations exist. First, sometimes ancient people would exaggerate the height of their enemies as a way to convey how terrifying they were. It was a writing style, so did ancient people see this height and know not to take it literally? Maybe. Maybe not. A second option is even more intriguing though. If you were to look up 1st Enoch 7:2 online, you may find that it doesn't list the height of the giants at all. So why was this important part of Enoch removed? The following analysis comes from the website els.thebookofenoch.info. Scholars now think that originally the Book of Enoch didn't tell us how tall the giants were at all. This verse was thought to originally be about 3 races of giants born by angels and humans. One of these races was called Eliud. As I mentioned, our manuscripts of 1st Enoch were damaged in some places and difficult to read. It is believed that this is one of those places, that early translators misread this verse when copying and changed it from a comment about 3 races of giants to a comment about their height. The word Eliud was changed to a form of measurement called ells. In 1839, translator John Beatty corrected this error. But in 1883, Robert Henry Charles, another translator, reinserted it by mistake. The mistake remained in the text until 2004, when Nickelsburg and Vanderkam noticed it and fixed it again. If this is correct, then Enoch never tells us how tall the giants were at all. So to find their height, we need to move on to source number 2. This one is, again, trickier than it seems at first. It's the Old Testament book of 1 Samuel. In my previous videos, we discovered that the Nephilim turned up again in the Bible after the flood. You're probably familiar with one of their descendants, Goliath, the most famous giant in the entire Bible. Well, most people don't realize that his lineage is actually mentioned in the Bible. 1 Samuel 17 says he's from Gath. Well, Joshua 11:22 tells us who lived in Gath. The Anakim, whom we find out in Numbers 13:33, were descendants of the Nephilim. So if you put it all together, Goliath was from Gath, the Anakim lived at Gath, the Nephilim were Anakim. Goliath, probably a Nephilim. If we can discover his height, we can approximate the height of the Nephilim. 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 4 tells us exactly how tall Goliath was, it seems. If you pull out your modern Bible, it likely says Goliath was 6.5 cubits tall, just under 10 feet tall. For reference, the tallest human to ever live that we know of was 8 foot 11 inches according to the Guinness Book of World Records. Okay, so we're closer to the ballpark of scientific discoveries, but we're still kinda dabbling in sci-fi land here. Could this be a case of exaggeration to make Goliath seem more menacing? Maybe. Or, here's a plot twist, not every Bible lists the same height for Goliath. There's another option. The height of 6 cubits in a span comes from a translation of the Hebrew Bible called the Masoretic text. It's often called the traditional Hebrew Bible because that's the text that most of our modern Bible translations are based off of. However, it's from the medieval period, and it's not our oldest biblical manuscript. In fact, our oldest biblical sources say something else entirely. That's rather suspicious to me. So I went back further to source number 3, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and a Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. The Greek Septuagint is abbreviated LXX, and it's super interesting because that's the translation that the writers of the New Testament read and quoted from in their day. So for me, I tend to value it highly in my research. What did these sources say about Goliath? Well, in that exact same verse, 1 Samuel 17:4, it says Goliath was 4 cubits and a span, 2 full cubits shorter. That would make Goliath just under 7 feet tall, so he could play in the NBA if he were here today. So what happened to the modern Bible? That's not really that tall. At first, it seems the story of the giant Goliath may have been exaggerated a little. Some scholars suggest that the Jews tended to exaggerate the height of the giants as time went on. There's even a manuscript that says Goliath's height was 5 cubits in a span. There's a good chance, though, that this scribe wasn't sure which number was correct, 4 cubits, 6 cubits, so he may have just split the difference. But what should we do? First, we can probably wipe the 5 cubit option off the table, because the vast majority of manuscripts say 4 cubits or 6 cubits. It's decision time. Usually, I am tempted to go with the oldest writing. After all, in many cases, that is the safer bet. That would put Goliath just under 7 feet tall, which could be corroborated by archaeologists, and still make Goliath a giant in his day. After all, the average Israelite at that time was only around 5 foot 5 inches tall. Josephus, a Jewish historian, also listed Goliath at 4 cubits and a span, making the source used by most Bibles look more like an exaggeration. However, once again, it's more complicated than it seems. I thought I had this mystery solved until I saw this. In a research paper by Dr. Clyde E. Billington called Goliath and the Exodus Giants, How Tall Were They?, he suggested that maybe this isn't a case of scribal exaggeration after all. Clyde uncovered an important clue, but it throws a monkey wrench in our investigation. The problem is, many different nations had a measurement called a cubit, and apparently nobody agreed on exactly how long it was. There was no universal standard. Even worse, a cubit was an approximate measurement, not a fixed standard of measurement. As Clyde's paper says, the ancient cubit was the distance from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. The span was the distance between the tip of the little finger to the tip of the thumb when the fingers were spread as far apart as possible. The ancients assumed that 2 spans made 1 cubit. I wonder if you can detect the problem here. This kind of measurement is not very scientific. The length of a cubit varied depending on who was doing the measuring. Kind of like how originally 1 foot wasn't a fixed 12 inches, but eventually it was standardized based on the length of King Henry VIII's 12-inch long foot. So, 2 people could measure Goliath and come up with completely different numbers. A tall person would have a longer forearm than a short person, meaning we can't know Goliath's exact height based on the Hebrew cubit. We can only guess. Clyde argues that when scholars estimated a cubit to be a fixed 18 inches, they made a mistake, and he recommends that modern Bibles remove the footnote that says a cubit is equal to 18 inches. Since David killed Goliath, he's probably most likely the person who measured him before cutting his head off. David was an average height for an Israelite. Clyde's paper says, for those who are 5 feet 0 inches, their cubit would be about 16 inches. Assuming a 16.5-inch cubit for a David who was 5 foot 3 inches would indicate that Goliath was about 8 feet 11 inches tall. Note, this matches the height of the world's tallest person according to the Guinness Book of World Records. Okay, now we're starting to get into the world of realism. Incidentally, David may have measured Goliath with his helmet on, and this may have increased his height. The Philistines are known for their plumed helmets which they wore, so if you take the helmet off, he might actually be a little bit shorter than that. Well, now we're stumped again. What are we supposed to think? Accounting for the fact that a true length of common cubit varies, Goliath could now be anything between 7 feet tall and 10 feet tall. We need a tiebreaker. So what other sources do we have left? There is one more ancient source from another nation that mentions giants, and they had a standardized cubit, which could really help us narrow down the range here. Source number 4. Ancient Egyptian writings speak of Canaanites whom they called Shasu. This was a general term that included Israelites, the Nephilim's descendants called the Anakim, and quite a few other people groups. The Egyptian text called the Craft of the Scribe says this: the face of the past is dangerous with Shasu, hidden under bushes. Some of them are 4 or 5 cubits, nose to foot, with wild faces. The difficulties continue though, as the English translation of this line is actually kind of deceiving. Egyptologist Charles Ayling says this phrase nose to foot in hieroglyphics actually refers to total height. Talk about confusing. Now here's where we can find some valuable numbers though. The Egyptians were one of the few civilizations who did have a standardized length for their cubit. It wasn't a loose estimate like the ordinary Hebrew cubit. According to Billington, the actual size of the Egyptian cubit was 20.65 inches. This would mean the Egyptians saw giants in Canaan ranging from 6 foot 10 inches to 8 foot 7 inches, right around the height of the tallest human known to walk the earth. What about that discrepancy in the Bible, though? Is the modern Bible's height for Goliath an exaggeration? Billington has an interesting theory. According to Jewish tradition, the Greek Septuagint was translated by request for one of Egypt's pharaohs, Ptolemy II. Billington's paper says the Ptolemies, descendants of a general of Alexander the Great, were Greeks, and they were Greek-speaking, as were almost all of the citizens of Egypt's capital city of Alexandria. Jews made up about a fourth of the population of Alexandria, and in time, they forgot their Hebrew. So the Jews in that area of the world were speaking Greek at this time, and so was Egypt's pharaoh. Who knew? What would this mean for our investigation? If the translators wanted the Greek Old Testament to make sense to Pharaoh and the other Greek-speaking Egyptians and the Jews living there, well, they would have to convert Goliath's height from the common Hebrew cubit to the Egyptian royal cubit, which is standardized. This does make sense. If Clyde is correct, then no exaggeration took place from the original biblical text to the modern Bible. They're just using a different cubit in both cases. The discrepancy between the modern Bible, the Septuagint, and the Dead Sea Scrolls could possibly be explained this way. Simple unit conversion. 4 cubits in a span in Egyptian royal cubits is approximately equal to 6 cubits in a span in ordinary Hebrew cubits. All of the biblical sources might actually be in agreement, they're just using different cubits. What if Clyde is wrong, though? It seems we would still be dealing with a non-standardized cubit, so it may be a mistake to assume that the cubit equals 18 inches. We can't use the ordinary Hebrew cubit to calculate Goliath's exact height. We can only estimate a range. There is another subtle piece of evidence in the Bible, though, but from a different author. Source number 5, Deuteronomy chapter 3. Here's another giant, King Og, whom the Israelites fought. The only things we know about this guy is he was a giant and he had a very large iron bed that was displayed like a trophy after he was killed. It says his bed was 9 cubits long, an approximate 13.5 feet. The true length of Og's bed, though, it's probably unknown to us, but it's still safe to say he was probably unusually tall to have a bed that big, corroborating that Goliath had an unusual height. I should note that there is one more source that I left out of my analysis. The Quran also speaks of ancient giants that some think may be the Nephilim. This book says their height was around 100 feet tall, but I chose not to include this because it's an outlier and it was written quite a bit later than the other sources. Around 650 AD, over 1,000 years or more later than the biblical sources and the Egyptian text. Clyde Billington's paper is going to go on to argue that Goliath could have been on the taller end of this range we've discovered. Taller than the world's tallest person, and he bases this on what we know about the armor worn by Goliath and the Philistines. Goliath's armor would have been very heavy, and Clyde argues that Goliath would have had to be extremely tall in order to be able to move in it. No warrior would ever wear armor they couldn't move in. Me? I see his point, but I'm not totally convinced. Consider this view from the book Origin of Evil Spirits by Archie T. Wright, and it involves the origin of demons. In the New Testament, Mark chapter 5 mentions a man possessed by a demon who was so strong that he couldn't be restrained even with chains. This man was of normal size, but he's directly linked to the Nephilim. But how? It doesn't say anything about Nephilim. Aha! Well, the original Jewish definition of a demon was a disembodied spirit of a Nephilim. Yeah, they thought that when the giants died, because their spirit was half angel and half human, it couldn't get into heaven or hell, yet roamed the earth looking for a new body. So according to this view, when Goliath died, for example, his spirit may have gone on to possess someone, giving them supernatural strength. See the link in the description to read more of Archie T. Wright's work. It's really good. This is just a guess, but I once heard a story from a prison guard who was attacked by an inmate who was on drugs. He tried to defend himself by beating the inmate with a nightstick, but the prisoner couldn't feel a thing. He seemed to be invincible and unnaturally strong. All this to say is I'm not sure Goliath had to be 10 feet tall to carry that armor. There may be other solutions. Maybe something about being possessed gave them supernatural strength or blocked pain receptors in the brain, similar to how drugs do. I don't know, but somewhere between 6 feet and 9 feet tall is probably our answer. I'm curious to know what you think of this evidence. Do you think all of these sources can truly be reconciled to be saying the same thing? Are you compelled by Clyde's theory that the difference is a simple conversion problem? Or a problem of a cubit not having been standardized? And did I successfully change your mind to think that the giants might be able to be reconciled with modern science and archaeology? Let me know in the comments. But now, have you ever wondered how the Nephilim turned up again after the flood? Watch this video next to hear 3 theories.